our family cultures, our school cultures, even our corporate cultures that we walk into have this assumption that we kind of have this linear career path. The facts are it's not linear at all. It's incredibly dynamic. On average, we're each spending about 4 years with any given employer and then moving into jobs and opportunities that haven't even been invented yet as we move through our career. And so what I really realized and what I wanted to try and help solve with this framework was creating a new paradigm for understanding our careers as not linear, but dynamic opportunities that we have agency over, and really shifting a lot of the anxiety we feel into agency and empowerment.
Jessica, thanks so much for joining today. It's been really great to meet you at the conference recently in San Diego. And starting from that, just learn about all the cool work you're doing and be able to talk about it together on this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Vince. I think it was the most serendipitous event meeting I've had in a while, where in 5 minutes or less, we were able to figure out 3 different opportunities to work together on. So
yeah, it's awesome. I'm going to dive straight in because I think I want to leave the most amount of time to actually hear about this cool concept of career game loop and just the way you think about game design and career and personal development and so on. So before we dive into sort of that topic itself, what do you see as the biggest challenges that you see in the way that people are leading their own careers today that has motivated you to think about this new approach?
Yeah, I think this has been a multi-decade journey for me on really my life's mission has been about how to connect people to opportunity, really more people making more money, because I do think a thriving middle class is what makes society work best. But one of the areas that I've always been struck by is that our family cultures, our school cultures, even our corporate cultures that we walk into have this assumption that we kind of have this linear career path. The facts are it's not linear at all. It's incredibly dynamic. On average, we're each spending about 4 years with any given employer and then moving into jobs and opportunities that haven't even been invented yet as we move through our career. And so what I really realized and what I wanted to try and help solve with this framework was creating a new paradigm for understanding our careers as not linear, but dynamic opportunities that we have agency over, and really shifting a lot of the anxiety we feel into agency and empowerment.
I mean, it personally really resonates. In school, I changed my major something like 7 times. And then even professionally, like worked in the US and went to Africa for a year, then went to Latin America for a year, like switched different things. And so the fact that it's nonlinear, I'm glad you're describing it that way. Some people would think that I was just lost for a long time.
Right. Especially your parents, I'm sure.
Yeah. But okay, so that makes a ton of sense from a context. Now, can you share with me a little bit your core thesis? What does it mean to be approaching your career as a game?
I've had this kind of interesting trajectory in this pursuit of how do I get more opportunity to more people, where I started off in more traditional ed tech. And then I realized that many of the people I was trying to serve and support, primarily kind of middle school up through university, were spending more time playing video games than they were in classrooms. So I have this sort of mashup of video gaming, education, and workforce experience in my career. So that mashup kind of led me to this concept of a career game loop. If you think of any video game you play, and in fact, any game, a card game or a board game, at the core is this concept of a game loop. And it's actually where all the magic of the engagement happens in a game. If you're playing Uno, it's just that concept of dealing the cards around and laying down a different color or number, and you're building the skills to be able to master a simple game like Uno. That applies to every single game. And as we thought about the circuitous nature of our careers and the looping nature of our careers, we realized that it almost mirrors the concept of a core game loop. And what we're trying to do in our careers is actually master the mindset and behavior of that 4-year cycle and having agency over it, which really led us to this concept of a career game loop. The career game loop has 4 distinct parts. The first is going on your quest, really figuring out what it is that you want to do next. And it feels a lot like being dropped into an open world video game in our job markets right now, where there's no rule book. Nobody is giving you a guide on how to navigate it. You've got to bump around and build relationships, figure out what feels good, what doesn't feel good. It's this very kind of organic learning process. Then you've got to build the skills, which is the second phase, leveling up. The third is how do you actually master getting that job? So how do you achieve that holy grail of getting the job that you really are trying to target and go after? And then finally, after you've been in that role for a few years, you've succeeded, you've made your impact, you're getting curious about something next. How do you actually craft into the next opportunity, just like you do in a lot of video games like Minecraft, where you're actually crafting and customizing the game itself into your next role?
So interesting. And the really, yeah, interesting parallel. I was, as you were talking, thinking about the different games that I play. And I hadn't heard of the term like game loop. But yes, like all the games have this a bit of a iterative nature where you're taking a bunch of actions and then based on that, like things change. And then you have to adapt your strategy when you're constantly responding to the environment. So I think the four things you shared track well in terms of the typical steps that people go through, as you say, career game loop. What does the framing do for the person's like mindsets and approach to career that differs from how they would normally approach their career?
The first thing that really shifts is what I was describing earlier, in that it really empowers you to have more agency. You don't feel as much a victim to the opportunity or the circumstances in front of you. I think the agency improvement that happens is critical. It gives you sort of this mental map or mental model, just like you said, Vince, like, okay, wait, I've played these games before. I sort of know that I'm actually learning a whole bunch in these games in order to move through these loops. So I'm understanding actually this is just a part of the process. And I think the third kind of key thing that happens when you frame it as a game is the failure that happens constantly in games, which is really just learning, as we all know, is normalized. So you don't have as much of this trigger response and then this fight or flight of, oh my God, I'm failing. I must not be meant for this career or this direction. I could never do this, and like leaping out and literally running away from it. I think it actually helps you understand this is a totally normal part of the process in going through trying to achieve anything that I want to next in my career. The key is that the reframe is really about empowerment.
I definitely, yeah, I really like that. So the idea that you're sort of in control and also this concept of resilience that comes from taking failure into something that's just a normal part of the process.
Right.
Are there any specific kinds of games that you think particularly mirror well to this environment?
Yeah. Well, we actually I think of the process of how we wrote both the book and the overall framework as a collective. I think oftentimes people think you're in this dark room for 2 years and then out comes a book. But it was actually really a community-based project and experience. And we co-wrote it with over 50 different video games to try and bring to life these key principles. So I've already mentioned kind of an open world video game. Legends of Zelda is probably the most famous one that people know. And even the trailer for that just shows what it feels like to get into the job market after your very linear progression in the education system, which, by the way, I'd love to hear your story on this because you had an incredible academic career and a very successful linear progression into the job market. And then you kind of just get thrown in like an open world video game. And a lot of what made you successful academically is what makes you paralyzed in some ways
Yeah,
in
for sure.
in the real world. So yeah, Legends of Zelda is a great one around just like the open world part of it. The concept of failure, there's so many great examples of that. And so just anytime that I'm looking at a game, I'm actually analyzing how the game designer is bringing in failure. There's one video game in particular that was like it's an indie game that was perfectly designed to make you fail really hard. You don't just like go back a level. When you fail, you end up having to restart the whole game over and over again. That's another one of the games that we're profiling in the book.
Interesting. Yeah, as we were sharing and sort of the question you're asking, I was thinking back, and there's like two parts, I guess, to this answer. At the point about if you're really successful in a more linear like system, how do you navigate the uncertainty? I think that's definitely the case. Like I think a lot of people just chase the next thing that you should ace, like the next
Right.
test. And then once the test is gone, you're like sort of lost. Like what's my purpose when there's no clear next thing to just do and like check off. I think for me, actually, a couple years after graduation was informed by what I did in operations research in undergrad, but I think probably has some linkage to games in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
The main like principle I worked under was maximize uncertainty, like chase uncertainty. Because when I chase uncertainty and like tackle career options that are super different from what I already know, I discover things that I didn't quite know before and really learn my true preferences. And especially in my 20s, I have to really discover my preferences and like what's available out there. Now, if I sort of translate to the game scenario, I would suspect games that have certain elements of uncertainty and randomness, and like the idea that you have to test something to like discover what the constraints are, would be more realistic than the games that where the rules are so deterministic that like everything you take, there's no uncertainty around it. It's just like there's always the right answer.
Right,
So
right.
yeah,
I
there's
mean, how do you think you're unique? I mean, one of the big motivations for me getting this out into the world was the incredible diversity of people who were struggling from this. At
yeah,
Unity, we upskill about 1 million students a year at a global level. So we have incredible exposure from community colleges to Ivy Leagues to Chinese universities and Indian top tier
yeah.
universities. And what I have found is those students that are most successful, as I mentioned, academically, have the most difficulty when they enter into this real world. So what made you be more comfortable with that uncertainty?
It's interesting. I mean, there may be a couple things. One, the fact that I chose to be an entrepreneur is a revelation that I generally have high tolerance for risk, which I think risk tolerance is actually relatively innate. There's obviously some nurture component too, but a lot of it
Mm-hmm.
is like some people just really dislike risk, and some
Right.
people are like much more risk seeking. I think it's somewhat of a personality trait as well. So I think I'm probably naturally quite risk taking. But the other thing that I think was really important in my mind was moving beyond the need for validation, external validation. Like I think
Mm,
the linear path that people get really used to in your school is all about external rewards. Like, oh, someone told me I did a good job. Like I got 100 on this test. Like I'm constantly getting evaluated. I'm
right.
playing somebody else's game and I just got to level up in that game.
So well said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think for me, the way that my mindset changed when I started going to Tanzania and America was I don't think I should be competing with other people in the same lane. I should be creating my own lane. And
Yeah.
when you sort of move beyond having to figure out how do I succeed and compete others, but more like, oh, how do I discover the thing that I think I'm uniquely well suited to do? I think you lose this need to like this paralysis because you're like super worried. Oh, am I making the wrong thing? Like, what if I'm falling behind? I just think I sort of lost that insecurity once I decided to view my career in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Congrats. It's such a big, yeah. It's an unusual breakthrough.
If I were to narrow down, there's probably like one mentor I can really think about who's always been kind of a trailblazer and really shaped my thinking around this. And I'm very grateful for her for kind of giving me some good leadership principles and like life principles that I still adhere to. So it's probably like a big thing is like a role model or mentorship you get. I don't think it's easy to necessarily get there if you don't have other role models that's around you that show you that that's actually very doable and like noble and interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
You're actually bringing up the key, kind of the soul of the career game loop is community.
Mm.
So we spend a ton of time in the framework really unpacking what is a mentor, what is a coach, what is an advocate, how do you build those relationships for the long term? What do you actually like show up for in that meeting? How do you follow through on it just to really lay the groundwork for these innate skills that you probably had because you were strong at relationship building that we're finding is not consistent in this next generation of employees?
That's so interesting. Why is community such a core part? Because some might say, well, some games are solitary.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
so how does community play into the concept of the game loop?
Yeah. Well, just first and foremost, from a gaming perspective, multiplayer games are the biggest breakout games from both an engagement and business model
And they
perspective.
sustain, right? Like people don't
Yeah,
lose trust after a while.
incredible sustaining power. It's like the new shopping mall. Most young people spend their time socializing in these games now, as opposed to going and hanging out in
Right.
person
Yeah.
somewhere. And to answer your question directly, community is so critical because social capital is the primary way we get opportunity. Unfortunately, the less you earn, the less you rely on your professional network and social capital. It's, again, not a learned or understood asset of how to cultivate it and how to keep it and grow it throughout your career. And so what we were really trying to do in this book was to take what we know high earners do really well, which is their professional network is their greatest asset in their career, and really kind of open up and unlock for everybody to provide accessibility into how to build that. Another really key element that we see in gaming, which then applies to our professional network, that you're not just socializing and creating community in these multiplayer games with your friends who live near you. You're actually doing it with people from all over the world. And there are multi-year friendships that happen where you've literally never met in person and you have like deep, meaningful relationships with these people. When you translate that to our professional networks, it's incredibly similar that you may have worked with somebody or connected with somebody and they turn out to be the key people who actually unlock opportunity for you. Your weaker ties and the people who are further out. Nitsan Pelman is one of the key people we interview in the book who describes this, that your weaker ties are actually the ties that unlock the greatest opportunity
Yes.
for you. And it's very similar in gaming and multiplayer games too.
Super interesting. Yeah. Okay. So in addition to community, what are some of the principles from game that really play out here in the career space?
Yeah, well, I think we've named a few of them already, which is just being okay with uncertainty, navigating uncertainty. You actually brushed across one of them in your own experiences that I'd love to build out a little bit more, which is when you're figuring out what you want to do, most people only do that from their sphere of awareness and influence. When we kind of surveyed young people, more than half of them said that they wanted to be social media influencers because that's like who they're spending most of their time interacting with. Yeah. And in fact, when you actually get really curious in your quest in this kind of open world video game and start trying to understand things that you have no kind of like day-to-day relationship with, that's where you find the greatest opportunities in your work in that quest phase. In the leveling up phase, and actually one of the biggest realizations I've had in my own work, I had the opportunity to run a company that had learning designers working with game designers. And the fascinating thing I realized is that they are pretty much the same job. Like there's actually not a difference really when you look at their job description and what they're doing day in and day out in creating deeply engaging content. The game designer usually has a bigger budget than the learning designer has and more interactivity, but it's the same concept. And so when you think about that realization of, wow, learning, like designing for learning and designing for engagement is almost the same thing. You realize that when you are going through your own learning experiences, you can actually have agency and design your own tutorials and your own path, almost again as a game designer of your own career. We have this concept in the framework called the law of little quests, which is how do you take this big idea of something that you want to do next? Let's say we're starting our own boba shop. And how do you actually break that down into smaller components and create sort of your own tutorials mashed up together with mentors, coaches, YouTube videos, a course at a community college, interviews with other boba store owners to be able to like create your own learning journey. And that's very much what happens when you're trying to learn how to master a new video game.
So what you're saying triggers me a thread I want to follow. We've chatted a lot about individuals adopting this mindset of a game protagonist or the hero of the game. I think influencing individuals to adopt new mindsets is usually like a pretty hard battle, like unless they already believe that. I suspect the easier thing to do is to work with the organizational leaders or whoever is creating the condition, the environment in which these individuals function. I'm helping them to better adopt more of a game mindset that allows them to like exhibit some of these positive mindsets and behaviors.
Right.
So I'm curious, and the learning design is like a very interesting example of it, but of course there are different applications of game mindset in different parts of an organization. In your work, are you seeing this concept of game mindset being applied to teams or learning sessions or functions or whatever it may be? And if so, can you give a couple examples where that has been very successful in helping people behave in a new way?
Yeah, I think you've really painted the correct picture, which is how do leaders of teams and organizations think about creating the right context and environment and culture and incentives to be able to motivate this continuous learning and upskilling and career looping that we want people to do. So I think that is happening. The reason why it's happening is frankly from a sense of urgency. You've covered a lot already on your prior podcast, just how much is changing, both from the demand for skills, what the future looks like, and how we need to behave within that. So I'll assume that's all well understood. So that urgency really creates an environment where you can no longer have perfectly linear paths of what the learning is that needs to be achieved, that everyone goes through and is compliant with. In fact, what you have to be doing is actually motivating them to have much more agency over it and creating the right incentives. The companies that I've seen achieve this really well have almost gaming dynamics built in without necessarily knowing it. So instead of a linear path of learning that you have to achieve, you have a set of decision trees really laid out that provides for choice for the individual, which is a key part of engagement in games. I think a second key part, which your company is crushing, is the collaborative learning. That is a really critical part of this engagement that we're seeing, which is how are we learning as teams together and building that shared knowledge and shared culture along the way. And then I think a third part, which I'm seeing in people who are reacting to this framework in the book, I'm excited, to be getting a lot of calls for me to come out and speak and bulk purchases for it. And I'm getting them from some pretty traditional industries that is surprising me. One in particular that I can't name is a large financial services company. I think what's really resonating for them are two things. One is the job crafting concept, because they really want to retain their top employees and give them the next opportunity. And so really laying out how do you actually craft within your existing employer into a new role, and then also incentivizing it and motivating people to know, of course, like this is completely okay. And we're actually going to reward you with promotions or new levels if you take that initiative and design, your next opportunity or completely transition into an entirely different function with the same employer.
That's really interesting. So in the third one, just to clarify, are you saying they are thinking of individual, almost like imagining what their next job could be? Or are you saying they're crafting jobs for internal mobility in a way that sort of makes people excited to go see it as an opportunity to level up, like in a game?
The former,
Okay.
and supported by the latter, because we know that when you are interfacing with the products or you're interfacing with the customers, you are seeing opportunities that leaders cannot always see. So you're seeing how your job could or should be shifting as a result of this. I'll just give an example that I'm sure most of your listeners have gone through or are going through, which is with the evolution of AI, learning teams are no longer creating content. That can be done. But they actually are turning much more into the learning designers. And so they've seen that shift happen. They're being disrupted. Their day-to-day job has been disrupted by this new technology. Get ahead of it. Say, okay, I can actually get my job done, my day job that I used to do done by AI. Instead, I'm going to do these higher order skills because I better understand the user I'm serving. I understand how humans are interacting in this learning environment, and I'm going to change my role to adapt to that. And I'm going to work with my manager to propose that change, which kind of highlights to the leadership what's actually happening on the ground level, as opposed to being subversive and feeling like you're trying to do it behind their back, being much more open and transparent and collaborative in the crafting process.
Yeah. The thing that I really like about the gaming framing, I think, is actually there are two things I really like about it in terms of helping, at least on the learning function, people elevate sort of the impact of learning programs. Is one, I think it really makes people think about the end-to-end experience more than like content, because game is necessarily very experiential and you have to think about like the person going through different things. And I think generally being able to zoom out and like think through the person's overall journey in the learning beyond just the little content they sort of get or the session that they do, I think is a very helpful lens to look through. And the second thing is, I generally believe one of the biggest determinant of whether a learning will land and have impact is whether people are just motivated to learn at all. Like,
Right.
do they want to learn? If you're a professional, I think the percentage of people who are thinking like, oh, I have a spare time, perfect time for learning. Like, that's not right. Like, people are busy. So you somehow need to create the context that gets people to want to learn. And game is just something that somehow people are just drawn to want to do because of
Right.
the way it's designed. It sort of gets to intellectual curiosity and fun and things like that. And so I love that it sort of forces you to think about that. But the one thing I do want to also, maybe let's dive into this now, that you differentiate is what you're doing is much more like game design and not gamification.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think a really critical distinction. Maybe actually you can speak to a little bit more on this.
Yeah, I think it's very related to what you were just describing too, which is the motivation aspects of it. The way I break down great game design versus gamification is almost like the features that surround a game without the game. Like, they
Yeah,
forgot to design the game, but they still have the leaderboards and the points and all the like extrinsic
yeah,
factors that sort of track your behavior and experiences within game, but
yeah,
they forgot to design the game.
yeah,
And what great game and learning designers do is they design for emotion. You're designing based on what you hope and based on what you research in the prototyping phase before you launch it. You're seeing the player feel. And the feelings are just so deep. I mean, the frustration is greater and stronger than you often see in real life. The empathy you have for the characters and then also the humans that you're playing with on their game and why you build such strong relationships. And so gaming to me, especially in your career, is a deeply emotional experience when we think about our careers. And I think that's oftentimes missed how we think about career design. We almost think about it from a gamification lens and not from a gaming lens, which
yeah.
is,
That's such a good way to put that. Yeah, people think
yeah,
about it. Yes, that's the core problem. You
right,
think about the
exactly.
little like things you get.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah,
But like the whole human feeling and what makes us human is
yeah.
not there in gamification. Yeah.
That distinction for me was really helpful because we use this word gamification a lot. Game is such a powerful concept, but I think in some ways the traditional view of gamification somewhat trivializes like the power of game in learning.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
and,
Yeah.
and not to completely dismiss it as a tactic, but I just don't think it's like
I think it's a critical
yeah,
tactic if you have
the
the
right
deeply
the thing,
feeling, yeah,
the
experience
core right.
included.
Yeah,
Call it a game or
exactly.
not. Yeah.
Yeah. I fully agree with you on that. Have you seen organizations that are particularly good at applying this game principle to their teams, either organizations or industries or something? And if so, can you give a very concrete example that made you go, huh, that's a really cool way to adopt the game concept in the workplace?
Yeah, you're going to be surprised at my answer because, as you know, I've been in tech my whole career. So you'd expect me to be highlighting some tech company. But I think the organization that comes to mind is the construction union.
Ah,
It's unbelievable at what has been designed to really support long-term sustainable career success. It's oftentimes not understood, especially from people like you or I who have never had the opportunity to have exposure to it. So first of all, it is an incredibly deeply engaging and emotional career journey. Even if you're later in your career, you kind of start off at this very early in career moment. You are being deeply invested in at that phase where you have very, very little skills. You have an incredible community around you. When I've been researching and working to better try and understand what's happening in these unions, the early in career people are showing up and investing because of the relationships that they have. It's, because my uncle brought me in or because a friend told me to get here that makes them continue to show up and learn every day through some really pretty hard labor in the beginning. But then you're quickly, as you're proving yourself and you're up leveling within months, you're moving into these unbelievable skilling opportunities that happen every year. And as part of the union fees that companies pay to hire union members, a very significant percentage goes into the annual professional development for that union member. I think it's like 5% of the fee you pay to hire a union person goes into the reskilling, which would like in the world of consulting that you were in before, you would never be like 5% of this consulting fee is going to go to my personal professional development.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like baked in. Of course, you have the pension and the long-term incentives too, but then also unbelievably, you have this incredible entrepreneurial training so that many people end up within a decade running their own companies and kind of leaving the union itself to become very successful business owners. Again, without this like very linear traditional path that they were successful at, because most people who end up going into the unions were those people who didn't feel like they were successful in school. It's an incredible microcosm, I think, of applying these game principles without really knowing, that you were doing it.
That's really interesting. And I was surprised by the industry that you
Right.
But the last example you shared actually kind of triggered another thought also. I'll share the question and then maybe like the context. I'm curious if you've seen this game concept, career game concept, resonate better with certain types of individuals with certain kinds of personality more than the other. And the reason why I ask is from my sort of like limited sample of personal experience, there are some people who naturally have this desire to become a business owner or entrepreneur someday. And I've seen folks with that kind of mindset seem to naturally have more of a game mindset, like in career, like where they're like, it's almost like they're leveling up and up and up and up until now they're the boss, right? And they seem naturally like not afraid of that responsibility, that open-endedness, but they're like sort of drawn to that quest.
Right.
Are certain kinds of people just much more predisposed to be able to thrive in a game-like environment versus not?
I think your intuition is right that certainly entrepreneurial people gravitate towards it and understand it. I also have had the experience consistently where people are like, oh, I'm not a gamer. And so there's this trope, right, of what a gamer is. Many people don't identify with it. But as soon as you break it down into like, have you ever played a card game? Have you played a board game? It's like you're a gamer. Right. You understand the basics and the fundamentals of how this works. It opens up people's minds and makes them more accessible. I would say though, back to like, what's the common theme of who it resonates with, independent, once you get past that gaming identity crisis that people have, is people who are curious, it resonates with. Like that natural curiosity really leads people, I think, into this space. I think all of us as humans have that curiosity. A lot of us have been taught not to trust it as much, right? It's been beaten out of us. And so a lot of my hope is, I truly believe you can't navigate your career any other way now. And so my hope is that we can reignite that curiosity in people who don't naturally have it at this point.
Speaking about inspiring people to become more curious and sparking that within people, what have you seen work really well from an organizational perspective? Do you have any leaders you've seen do this very well? And if so, how did they do so?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is what makes leaders successful that they have to leave behind when they become successful, which is having all the answers. I think when you as a leader sketch a problem that invites in collaboration as opposed to proselytizing the answer and saying only you have the answer and everyone should follow, is what really encourages and more deeply engages people into that type of direction. And inviting in that opportunity with a paint by number sketch that's halfway done, that then the rest of the leader and the team can be designing and filling in together.
It resonates because just my experience building Sparkwise and being part of training programs that were very effective, or leading workshops with clients when I was in consulting, the thing that really drove people to engage and immerse themselves was a really compelling articulation of the problem.
Right.
And like, once you give them the problem, here it is, like, we need your help, like, I want you to solve it, most people like start to really get into it. And once you're into it, you're like fully engaged.
Right.
And
Exactly.
I've always found problem solving to be the best way to learn. Not like lecturing or learning, but just give them a problem. And game is basically continuous problem solving, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
And
Exactly.
so like honestly, I think problem solving and game are the same. It's just that one sounds a little bit more like work like,
Right.
and the other
Right.
sounds more entertainment like.
That's right.
But it's essentially kind of the two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, don't you find in Sparkwise and the leadership work you have that it feels antithetical to actually not have the answer to the problem you're asking? Like you have to almost undo all the behavior that you've learned
Mm.
prior to be able to lead that way.
Yeah, for sure. Like, and it's a constant work in progress, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, as a leader, the thing that I'm learning to strike the balance, and I don't think I've learned how to do it well yet, but I'm constantly working on it, which is there's some things where the right answer is like this, right? And other times you really want to like let the different parts of the organization solve, and the right level of guidance at the right level of granularity with the right level of flexibility, right, is something you have to constantly like sort of gauge
Right.
and figure out how to do well.
You're speaking like a true game designer, that sentence.
But honestly, like when we designed Sparkwise, we used to say Sparkwise is learning meets escape room, right? Like that's how we
Oh,
used to
right, right.
describe it. We don't have any gamification, but we very much think like a game. Like we want the experience to feel a bit game-like. And so we're constantly thinking things like, how do we make a problem just tough enough that people get really excited, but it's not so hard that they give up,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Like how do you make them struggle with it a little bit more so that they like immerse themselves into it, then lead to the emotion of aha, like by
Hmm.
showing them what great looks like, but only after they've struggled with it, right? Like
Right.
these are all things that the game designers exactly like think about. And so
Right.
I think
Right.
that's why I think all the things that you say resonate, because I think just naturally how I think about creating experiences to get people to change their mindsets and behaviors and skills.
Yeah. And flow.
And
Yeah.
for yeah, so important. And by the way, like Sparkwise comes a lot actually not from learning actually. It comes from designing a lot of workshops for clients, leading large transformation programs back at McKinsey. Those workshops have to take clients on a journey.
Right.
Like they have to come in and you have to get them excited and inspired, get them really intellectually engaged, and make them walk away feeling like that was really productive. I know what I'm going to do next. I'm super motivated to go drive. And you spend so much time trying to construct these like incredible experiences that move people from A to B. And so a lot of Sparkles is literally inspired by how do we recreate that experience, less so the traditional learning, which I think
Right.
often doesn't have those kinds of elements as well built out.
Right. I would also assume you have to make them really fail and struggle
Yes.
too, because that journey, the hero's journey, like you have to have this moment of
Yeah.
what is the crisis or the challenge that
For sure. There's like a couple of
yeah.
different like things you have to paint, right? The first one is like you got to paint the urgency and the need up front. But
Mm-hmm.
also, what we often see is unless people are open to learning, whatever you try to teach folks don't land. Now, there are some things people naturally know, oh, I'm not good at this. I need to learn this. There are many things that people are overconfident about and actually think that they're really, really good, but there are actually a lot of things that could help them if they were better at it.
Mm-hmm.
Example, email writing. Everyone would say, I can write emails. Like I've been doing it for so many times. I actually think I would argue based on my conversations, some of the email writing tactics really are beneficial for everyone to learn because the average email in a corporate is like not well written. But the way we try to teach that is not just teach them all these best practices to which they'll go like, this is obvious. This is obvious. No, we ask you to like try to revise the email and then show you the gap between what you did and then what great looks like. Because then you
Right.
actually see, oh my God, I actually missed like a whole bunch of things. My
Right.
output was not as good as that. So there's a little bit of a productive failure. You need to make it not so hard that people sort of give up, right? Like there's a way to
Exactly.
balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If this
So,
Sparkwise thing doesn't work out, Vince, you can look at game design.
yeah, well, we should continue the conversation. But in general, like I think there's a lot of things we can continue to learn from each other on this.
Yes.
It sounds like you're already starting to talk with different organizations that are interested in implementing this in their own teams. I'm curious, there may be other folks that listen on here that want to also figure out, okay, how do I bring this to my organization and so on, what are things that they can do to either contact you or engage you in some way?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. So careergameloop.com is really where you can purchase the book. In addition to the book itself, we also have a coaching guide if you have small teams that you want to kind of lead through this. I'm also doing talking events for big bulk purchases to be able to better engage people. So you can find our work there. And of course, I'm really active on LinkedIn too. So would love to connect and engage and continue learning more from everybody in this area.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights here and bringing this lens to career development and career navigation, which I think is honestly going to be increasingly urgent and important. So many jobs getting completely kind of turned upside down or being disrupted
Right.
so dramatically. And I think this mindset of a game player who embraces new adventures and failures seem really important for everyone. So I look forward to learning more from you as we continue to chat beyond the show.
Thanks so much, Vince. It was such a pleasure.